All right, welcome back. So in this video, I decided that we're just really going to go over the theory that I wanted to talk about, and in the next video, we'll talk about the first part of charging, or the first phase of charging, which is pre-charging. So we'll talk about the technique. We'll pretty much go over the technique for the most part here, but we'll talk about it more officially in the next video. So what we're going to now talk about is something that I call memory transients, or transient memory, right? So that's actually a special state of negative memory that we haven't talked about yet, which is important in the context of pre-charging, or the pre-charging phase. So just to go over this first point, which actually has nothing to do with any of this, right? At least not directly, but there's a reason I'm talking about it. So it says in electronics, inductors and capacitors, sorry to see what I wrote. So in electronics, inductors and capacitors experience a transient period of time before current moves through them according to Ohm's law. So basically, just to go over that a little bit, break that down a little bit, in reactive circuits, right, or circuits that have an AC current going through them, which is not a DC current. So there's only the two DC currents and AC currents. AC currents are alternating currents, right? They go back and forth. So in those types of circuits, you can have special types of impedance. It's called impedance, which is just like a resistor, but it's a type of resistor that only works in reactive circuit, or it only works with AC currents. DC currents, you would just have a regular resistor. A resistor will work in an AC current and DC currents, but inductors and capacitors offer kind of resistance that only works with AC currents. But when current is moving through an electronic circuit, right, the voltage drop and the current running through any electronic device in the circuit, which could be a resistor, inductor, capacitor, could be an op-amp, but FET, field effect transistor. I was trying to remember. I learned this stuff years ago. But when a current travels through any electronic device in the circuit, right, if you want to know the voltage drop on that electronic device, or the current running through it, or even the resistance it offers, right, or the impedance it offers, you would use Ohm's law. So Ohm's law is just, which I should have wrote it down. It's really not important though. But Ohm's law is very simple, so it's just voltage equals current times resistance, right? So you can use that to find, and if it's a capacitor, I forgot actually what the measurement, how to find the resistance or the impedance for a reactive device for inductors or capacitors. But anyway, if you want to find the resistance or the impedance or the voltage drop, or the current, you would use Ohm's law. But that's only true, right, for when the current reaches a state that's called steady state. Now, in the very beginning, when you first turn on the circuit, which is usually very short time, less than a second, Ohm's law is not actually true, right? So you can't use that law to calculate the current going through in a capacitor or inductor, or the voltage drop against it. So why can't you use it? Well, there's a very special period of time, right, where in capacitors, the current has to build up, because I believe the physicists or electronics could fact check me, or the electrical engineers could fact check me if I'm wrong, because I haven't studied this stuff for years, but I'm pretty sure I remember it correctly. So a capacitor is basically just like almost like two walls, right, with something in between. I believe it's called a dielectric. It's like two plates. And it has to build up a charge, right? So in the AC current, it builds the charge and then it loses the charge each time the current moves back and forth. So while the plates in the capacitor are building the charge, right, Ohm's law is not going to work, because the value of the voltage across the plates is not constant, right? So Ohm's law presumes constant values, right, in the electronic devices in the circuit. So Ohm's law is not going to work. Same thing with an inductor. An inductor coils, right? So when current is moving through the inductor, it creates it creates a magnetic field which resists the motion of the current. So when the current moves through the inductor, it creates a magnetic field which actually resists the motion of the current. So while that's happening, it's actually impeding the current and preventing it from moving at the normal value predicted by Ohm's law. That effect, though, is pretty much worn off once the current finally gets through it, and then it reaches a constant value. So during that very short time for an inductor and a capacitor, the Ohm's law is just not going to work, because the values, the value of the resistance, or certain values for the inductor and the capacitor are changing, right? And then it takes a while before they reach a constant value, then Ohm's law works naturally. So the study of that process in electronics is called transient analysis, if my memory serves me. So why do I want to go over that? Why do I want to discuss that? Electronics, which, we're talking about the subconscious mind. Well, because interestingly enough, your mind actually experiences kind of something very similar, right? So just go over this next point. Negative memory also experiences a period of transience, right? During this time, negative memory takes time to reach full power, right? So in other words, for electronics, when the current is moving through a capacitor, an AC current is moving through a capacitor or an inductor, it takes a short amount of time before current reaches full value, or a constant value, which is called steady state, right? And then during that time, you can now use Ohm's law to predict it normally. Negative memory has the same process. So when you first, so I'm just trying to remember these points. Okay, yeah, we can probably read these now. So let me just say this first. So when you first focus on something, right? Negative memory, we've been basically saying that when you focus on something, some particular subject, you access the subconscious memory, right? So that subconscious memory switches to an active state, and it tries to influence your subconscious mind to revert back to the state of the association that's stored in the memory. And that association can basically be more negative or reflect ground state properties, which is negative memory, or it can reflect subconscious excited state properties, which corresponds to transcendental state of awareness, which corresponds to the positive memory. Now, based on what we've been saying, the moment you focus on a subject, the subconscious memory is accessed, and then it exerts a force on your subconscious to revert back to a previous state. Now, we haven't really talked about that in terms of timing. Well, how long does it take, and this and that, right? So for the most part, it's instantaneous, except for this special exception. So there actually is a time when we focus on the subconscious memory, right? If it's a negative memory, there's actually a period of time where it takes the subconscious to sort of, or it takes a while for the association stored in the subconscious memory to exert influence on your subconscious mind, or it takes a while for that influence to reach full power. So that is actually a special property that I refer to as memory transience, right? Now, this process doesn't actually happen at all, as far as I know, right? So this doesn't happen at all for positive memory, right? So over the years, right? So when I was studying all of this, right? So I was basically studying this every day, all day for years. All these principles that we're talking about here, and the ones we haven't gotten to later in this book and the second book. I just kept studying the subconscious, trying to model its behavior, how it works. And at one point, what I noticed was that there was something I was doing with my intention. I didn't notice at first. Now, initially, when I first started practicing this, right, I used to think that the longer I charged, right, or spent time trying to charge my subconscious, once I learned the subconscious charges, right, I kept trying to do it in long periods or long intervals, because I assumed the longer you charge, the more intense your charge is going to get, which is, that's actually not true, right? So that certainly is a reasonable assumption, but it's actually not true. An example I give in the book is like your phone, which we'll actually talk about this more later. I think I didn't have to put it in that section of the book, but I think I did it because it made this explanation easier. But we're really going to revisit that topic later after we talk about charging. But the way the subconscious charges is, if you can imagine your phone, right? So if you want to charge your phone, you put it in the charger, right? And if you want it to charge as fast as possible, then you put in the charger. Presumably you have a high power charger if your phone has a high power or low power charge. Then you just leave it in, right? You wouldn't take the charger out or take the USB out, the charger out, and then put it back in, and then take it out and put it back in. Obviously, it's not going to charge as fast if you keep doing that, right? You would want to just leave it in so it charges as fast as possible. Now, the interesting is your subconscious actually isn't like that. Your subconscious prefers intermittent charging, which, again, we'll talk about that principle later. So that would be like if you were to keep taking the USB out, or keep taking the plug out from your charger, or out of the wall for your charger, your phone would actually charge faster doing that than just leaving it in the whole time. So that's very strange behavior, but that's actually how the subconscious favors charging. And we're going to talk about that later. And the reason that actually happens as a result of negative memory. Now, when I was doing that, when I understood that principle and started practicing it a little bit, which I didn't know that at first, what I realized was something very interesting happened, right? So I noticed when I first would focus on something that had a lot of negative memories, like a song, I was trying to charge my subconscious to become very volatile to a song, right? So when I focus on the song, I feel a lot of, it's very, how do I want to word it? My subconscious has a strong affinity for entering a transcendental state. In other words, it's very easy for me to charge while focused on a song. And I would do that with a song that was old, right? So I'm charging my subconscious, or kind of recharging it in response to that particular song, which will affect how it responds when I focus on that particular song. So even though it was old, and which means my subconscious had very little response to it, when I charge it with that song as a subject, now it responds very strongly, and I feel a lot of emotion again and things like that. But what I noticed was something very interesting. When I would first focus on the song, right, I would notice that I didn't feel a lot of negative memory, right? It just didn't feel, it felt almost like it was new, right? And then after a couple seconds, right, I would feel all that negative memory come rushing in, right? But for those first few seconds, it was like there was no negative memory. I could charge super easily, right? And so what I did is I kind of just started studying that phase, that period of time. And whenever I would keep trying to charge during that time, I noticed it was super easy to charge. It was like there was just no negative memory around. So, which is exactly what happens when something's new. You could charge super easily because negative memory isn't stopping you. It basically took no effort as long as I kept focusing on this old song within that short period of time. And so, just to go over this next point, what I realized is that when I first focus on something that's old for the first few seconds, it basically is like a subconscious entropy dead zone, is what I call it. So, I should mention that that short period of time, negative memory is in what I call a transient state, or a transient state of negative memory. And a transient state is basically just refers to the state your negative memory is in before it reaches a steady, what we might call a steady state, or a full powered state. So in the full powered state, negative memory is working exactly the way we've been talking about this whole time. It exerts influence on your subconscious mind to stay in its ground state. And the strength of that influence is at full power. But when the subconscious is in a transient state, right, that influence from your negative memory, even though it's accessed and it's in an active state, it's actually not at full power, right? So it's actually very weak. So during that very short time, right, your negative memory is in what I call a transient state. So even though it's in an active state and your conscious mind is focused on the subject associated with that negative memory, the influence, the force of exertion from that negative memory on the subconscious to stay in its ground state is not there. We'll talk a little bit more about that here, right? But for now, that influence is not very strong. So during that time, right, it's basically what I call an entropy dead zone, which is not exactly correct, but that's just what I like to call it. You could basically approximate it as a subconscious entropy-free zone. So in other words, during that very short time, it's like your subconscious can just behave as if there's no negative memory. So it behaves almost like when something's new to you, right? So when you listen to a new song, you can enter transcendental state very easily, use transcendental imagination, you can charge very easily. Basically, it's a negative memory-free state of mind, right? So obviously that goes away after a while due to subconscious entropy, but for that short time, it's like when something's new, it's like a subconscious entropy-free zone, or approximates one. But when you focus on something, even if it is old and has a huge amount of negative memory, for the first few seconds, it also functions like an entropy-free zone, or entropy dead zone. So how long does negative memory stay in this transient state, or this transient memory state, when you first focus on something that's old? Well, like I said, it's only a few seconds, and just to go to this point here, it occurs roughly for the first 10 seconds after you focused on subject, right? So that's why so it's a very short time, and that's why it took me so long to notice it, right? Actually, the way I kind of discovered this, we'll talk much more about it later, because it has to do with metaphysical stuff that I was studying at the time. But I noticed eventually, right, that when I would focus on the song, and this is just a rough approximation, is 10 seconds. You know, for some people it may be 9 seconds. It may change depending on how much negative memory the song has. It might change in how volatile your subconscious is already to the song, which is basically just saying how much positive memory the subconscious memory associated with the song has. So it might change a little bit here and there, but for the most part, in my experience, I roughly clocked it to about 10 seconds. So when I would focus on the song, right, even no matter how old it is, right, it could be a song so old and I've heard so many times, right, that I just feel nothing when I hear it. It annoys me. However, when I focus on it for the first 10 seconds, I don't feel any of that, right? I can actually just charge normally. And so, if I keep focusing on that song within those 10-second intervals, which I'll explain a little bit about that here, I would feel my subconscious actually charging. Positive memory is now building because it's an entropy-free zone. So before getting into that a little bit, basically, to go over this point, negative memory functions at 0% power initially and goes to 100% power by the 10-second mark. So basically what that means is that negative memory increases on a scale. So within those first 10 seconds, it increases on a scale. Kind of, I mean, I don't know if it's linear or non-linear, let's say parabolic or whatever. But when I first focus on something that's old, right, for the first 10 seconds, the strength of that negative memory, the influence on my subconscious mind is increasing, right? So it's 0, which is exactly what happens with electronics. And when this capacitor or inductor is in a transient state, right? I believe it's a graph kind of like this. Almost like, it's not exactly like a parabola, but it's a curve, right? So it curves this way. And then this would show when some value, I think would be like voltage or impedance, reaches full power, or it would be current. But for your negative memory, it's very similar, right? So when I first focus on something that's old, the strength of the influence of negative memory on my subconscious mind is 0%. So it's nothing, right? Which is why I could charge so easily, right? And then as each second goes by, right, up to 10 seconds, that strength gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And I'll feel it in my negative memory, in my mind. And so when it reaches, by the time I get to about 10 seconds of focusing on this thing that's old, right, now I feel negative memory coming in at full power, and now it's a subconscious entropy full zone, or however you want to say it. So subconscious entropy is occurring at full strength, and now my negative memory is trying to pull my subconscious at full power into its ground state. That's why it's so hard to feel anything as I continue listening to the song. And so it takes about, it's not like it's the influence of negative memory is at 0% power at the first second I listen to the song, and it stays at 0% all the way to 10 seconds. So it doesn't do this. So this is time and this is the power axis. It doesn't do this until it hits the 10-second mark, and then just does that, right? Like it doesn't spike up at 10 seconds. So it actually goes on a curve. So it increases with each second until it reaches full power, right? And then at full power, it functions exactly the way negative memory does that we've been saying. So if this is true, right, now you probably have never noticed this with things that are old to you, because during those first 10 seconds, that's not really enough time to develop a significant charge or develop a significant amount of subconscious volatility. So you might not even notice it, because it's the amount of charging you do in those first 10 seconds is so tiny, right? It's difficult to even be aware of consciously. So what would happen if if I only listen to the song within that phase where negative memory is in a transient state? Well, positive memory would build like crazy, right? So that actually is what it means to pre-charge, which we're going to talk about more in the next video. But how long do I have to wait before I focus on something in a transient state? Or how long do I have to wait after something has gone into, after transient memory has reached full power, before I can focus on it again and transient memory goes back to 0%? So can I wait like 1 second, right? As soon as the 10-second mark is reached, I take my attention off the song, focus on it again, and it goes back to 0%. Well, no, that actually isn't how it works, and I know because I tested this, right? So when I first became aware of this and started studying the state and this nature of negative memory, I started clocking it, right? So I started clocking how long it roughly takes for me to feel like transient memory has gone back to 0%, right? And again, there's no meter or instrument I can use to measure this. I just have to see how I feel. Like I said, it's difficult to notice because there's so little charge that occurs in those first 10 seconds. So I had to keep practicing this and doing this to see what happens and see how I feel and get a sense of how long it takes. So based on my experience, right, roughly it takes about 10 minutes for transient negative memory to go back to 0%. So what that means is if I focus on some song, right, let's say I'm listening to a song and the song has a lot of negative memory, and then I focus on it for the first 10 seconds, it's a subconscious entropy-free zone. So I'm charging in those first 10 seconds, or building positive memory, and I don't feel weighed down by all that negative memory influence. And then by 10-second mark, negative memory reaches full power. Now I feel the weight of negative memory, and I don't feel much emotion, or I don't have much feeling. At that point, if I focus on the song again after, let's say, 2 minutes, right, the transient negative memory won't have gone back to 0 by that time. It might have only gone back to maybe 70%. So if I then focus on the song after 2 minutes and transient memory is still at 70% power, it might only take about 2 seconds for it to reach full power again, right? If I focus on the song after 5 minutes have passed, so if I focus on it for 10 seconds, then stop, and then wait 5 minutes, then focus on the song again, transient memory might be at 50% power. So it means that when I focus on the song, it'll only stay in that transient state now for 5 seconds. So I have to keep making more time elapse to get this maximum value of about 10 seconds in the negative memory's transient state. So like I said, I clocked it and I've calculated it to roughly 10 minutes. So if I listen to a song that's old, right, if I listen to it for the first 10 seconds I listen to it, I won't feel much negative memory. And then if I take my mind off of it after about 10 seconds, right? And then I listened to it again after about 10 minutes. Now transient memory has gone back to 0%. And now I can listen to it again in an entropy-free way for about 10 full seconds again. Now this value actually changes depending on the type of charge, right? But for the most part, the longest I've calculated to is about an hour. That's going to be for a type of charge we'll talk about much later, right, in the second book. However, for most charges, really for emotion, I clocked it to about 10 seconds. So what I started doing, right, to kind of bring everything home, is when I was testing this and I kind of calculated its value, I started putting it into action and testing how I feel with it. So like any theory, I had a prediction, right? And I wanted to see if my experience matched up with the prediction. So I started listening to this song, right, that was old, and I would focus on it for 10 seconds, right, then stop and take my mind off of the song so that it's not building more negative memories. So if I keep my mind on the song after that 10-second mark, subconscious entropy is at full power. My the influence of that negative memory to keep my mind in its ground state is there. And then it's just getting more negative if I keep my mind on the song. So what I started doing is I would listen to the song for 10 seconds, stop, right? So to stop building negative memory. And then I'd wait about 10 minutes, focus on the song for 10 seconds again, then stop, right? And I would keep doing that, right? And to see if this theory is correct. And that's what happened is exactly what I expected. I started to feel more and more and more excited by the song. In other words, my subconscious started becoming charged or more volatile to the song because I keep listening to it only in the entropy-free zone, right? And by doing that, positive memory just keeps building up very easily, right, as I'm listening to the song. This negative memory is effectively ineffective. It doesn't really do anything in that subconscious dead zone. In the entropy dead zone. So, as I'm keep listening to the song in those 10-second marks, right, and then waiting 10 minutes and listening for 10 seconds again, I'm becoming more excited and more excited by the song. And my subconscious is charging. I'm feeling more emotion. So this is actually opposite of what happens in a subconscious full zone, right? A subconscious entropy full zone. So normally when you listen to a song, let's say the song's new, there's no negative memory yet, but it's still a subconscious entropy zone, right? You would listen to it, and then the amount of emotion you feel from it as you listen to it drops. So it increases, and then it starts to drop more and more and more. So it increases because positive memory is still building up normally, but so is negative memory. Eventually, negative memory will catch up to it, and then you reach like an equilibrium point. I'll just draw it here. This is time, this is power. So when you listen to the song, when you listen to the song, positive memory and negative memory are both building up. Negative memory eventually catches up to it because your subconscious favors a ground state, which is subconscious entropy. It reaches this sort of equilibrium point, which I know it's not a straight line, but I think you got it. And then subconscious entropy eventually takes over and starts to overpower positive memory more and more and more. So your emotional stimulation drops, then it just levels off. So listening to the song more and more means less feeling and less emotion from the song. But when you listen to it in those 10-second intervals of the subconscious, the entropy dead zone, right, listening to the song more and more and more means more and more and more stimulation, just like when the song is new. So that's something interesting. So you can actually practice that. That's pretty much what it means to pre-charge. But we'll just talk about it more officially in the next video. Now, this was my experience because I was testing all of this and I made all of this theory up. I'm assuming everyone else's minds works the same way, or I've never actually tested if this does. I never trained someone on doing this yet, and asked them to see if this was happening. Actually, no, there was one time, I forgot I did teach someone how to do this and confirmed, as you might expect, that this does work for them too. But, like I said, this is how I clocked it for my experience. But yeah, you can test this, so I recommend to get a sense of this. Just focus on some song, let it be any old song. It should be a song that's old. If it's new, you're not really going to see this effect because there's no, even when negative memory reaches full power, it's such a small amount, you won't notice it. So listen to a song that's really old to you, right? Listen to it for about 10 seconds and then just stop, right? Stop, and then it may be shorter, a little shorter than 10 seconds. I don't think it'll be too much longer, but roughly 10 seconds. And then just stop, wait about 10 minutes, and listen to the song for 10 seconds again, and stop. And just keep doing that, and you're going to notice every time you listen to the song during that 10-second interval, you're going to feel more and more and more emotion each time you listen to it. And you're going to notice your subconscious is having a stronger reaction to that song. What that means is it's becoming more volatile, right? It's reacting more strongly, and it's developing a greater affinity for an excited state when you focus on the song. So that'll give you basically a sense of pre-charging and how it works. So yeah, that's pretty much it. In the next video, we'll just talk about pre-charging. Again, this is pretty much a technique for pre-charging, but we'll talk about it a little more officially in the next video. And then after that, we're going to move on to the main charging, because 10 seconds is really too short to do to get too much done with charging, but it really helps to make your subconscious more volatile, which makes the main charging phase easier, right? But then at that point, we'll talk about the more complete technique for charging the subconscious. Right, so that's it for now, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.